It is House of Strauss. We are joined by Nate Silver, a man who needs no introduction. But you know what? I'm going to butter you up a little bit. I'm going to butter you up first, Nate, before, as Doyle Brunson might say, putting a man to a decision. And then we can commence getting into this wonderful book of yours, which for those who are looking at this, they can see me holding this up on the
or
edge.
In the background, we got the green. Yeah, even greener green, I think.
Yes, greener green right there on the edge. The Art of Risking Everything, a fascinating book. You've effectively written about everything I've ever been interested in, all in one book. So I appreciate that. That's very cool of you, Nate. But we're recording this on the day that the Democrats, Kamala Harris, has made her vice presidential candidate pick. So in the spirit of your book, which includes a lot of people putting a percentage or odds on something that theoretically one cannot, there's a big discussion right now, a big discussion about whether or not Josh Shapiro, governor of the state of Pennsylvania, tipping point state, most important state in the election, smart, popular, crossover appeal in theory. The big debate right now is whether or not his being Jewish was a deciding factor in Kamala Harris shifting to governor of Minnesota, Tim Walz. So in the spirit of your book, where you put a percentage on these controversial, thorny, fraught, what is the percentage that you would put on Josh Shapiro's Jewishness as the deciding factor in his being passed over, as it were, and having predicted swing against him to Walz? And I will add one little thing before I give you your time to answer that. I am bundling the pro-Israel position of Shapiro into the overall Jewishness. Yes, I'm specifying just to make things simpler, number one, and number two, because I believe that his views on Israel are a fairly normative Jewish guy position. So let's start with that, and then we'll get into the book.
Yeah, I was going to ask kind of to use a definition in a sentence and kind of National Spelling Bee style. The bundle of Jewishness plus his views on the conflict in Gaza plus the left being upset about his position on the conflict in Gaza and why that is exactly, I think that's probably about half of it. The Jewish part alone, I think, might be a little bit less than half of it, but why he has these kind of, on the one hand, normie Democratic positions, two-state solution, Netanyahu bad, Hamas bad, is basically the kind of trilogy of standard center-left Democrat positions on Israel. He did volunteer as a younger person in the IDF, not in a combat role, but so there are a couple of things like that. But no, this kind of metastasized into a story where clearly the left was going to pick a fight if he was chosen. And if you're conflict averse, as Democrats usually tend to be, although not with Biden, when they replaced Biden, if you are conflict averse and you want to make a consensus-based decision, then sometimes silly things become real things, right? I mean, in the book, I call this community the village. The village is basically politics, media, maybe except for Substack, government, etc. And it's a consensus-driven place where you are afraid of offending people, where you're not necessarily taking the higher upside play if it risks blowing up in your face or if it risks, unpleasant social consequences. And I think this was a risk-averse decision. Not outside the boundaries of the margin of error. I mean, I think Tim Walz is a pretty good candidate. And the downsides are maybe overrated, but there are actual downsides. I mean, she has a lot of momentum. I think momentum in politics, like in sports, is usually overrated, but maybe this is kind of an exception where she was just chosen as a candidate a week and a half ago. Is that right? I mean, it's been not been very long.
Yeah.
So I kind of understand it, but it contrasts with this bolder decision that Democrats made to shove Joe Biden in front of a bus because he was going to lose. And then the kind of very quick, bold consolidation around Harris. And it makes me think, a bit, it's a more conventional Democratic way of doing things, which is kind of risk averse and consensus driven, as opposed to gambling on this candidate who obviously has very high upside, but might present a headache or two.
I'm going to put it at 53.5%. His
there
Jewishness
yeah.
is the deciding factor. It's complicated with VP picks, though, because there are misaligned incentives where candidates don't want to be shown up by a talented VP because people might murmur about how, and then you've got on the other side where you've got weird incentives. We don't even discuss how Brian Kemp would be a very wise VP pick for Donald Trump. Instead, we discuss how he's slamming Kemp at a rally because of his own personal grievances. So the personality of the candidate can get in the way of doing what is best for maximizing odds of victory.
Yeah, look, I think that's a non-trivial factor, the kind of upstage thing. I mean, the analogy I used on my podcast with Maria Konnikova is that, like, what's it like if you had Joe Biden win the Democratic nomination in 2008 and then Barack Obama becomes his VP pick? Now, look, I think Harris is a more dynamic politician than Biden, although Biden wasn't bad back in the day. And although Shapiro has some Obamian affect, he's not Obama yet. But there's a little bit of an issue of being upstage, but you want to create excitement and they've battled the election to 50-50 roughly in our model, but 50-50 is still 50-50. I know there's some football analogy of a situation where the math says to go for two in a situation that most people don't.
I've got the football analogy here because this might not be analytical per se. This is more of a vibes, Bill Simmons-y take on it. The reaction of people who want Trump to win today looks a little bit like when your fan base is watching a football game and the opposing coach doesn't go for it on 4th and inches and you're just relieved. That's what it looks like. So that's not scientific, but you could say that it was a poor choice just based on how thrilled and relieved they appear to be.
Yeah, one of the Trump polling strategist leads was like, giddily tweeting yesterday, it's going to be Tim Walz. I've heard it's going to be Tim Walz, exclamation point, exclamation point. It's like, maybe you shouldn't be going with Tim Walz then. If the other party understands its strategic consent. I mean, you feel that, right? If you're a football fan or you're playing poker or anything like that, then you really benefit when your opponent makes a bad decision, right? Even if it's an uncertain probabilistic decision, then you're like, oh, that was really nice of this opponent to like fold this hand that could have caught a flush against me or whatever else when she had the odds to continue or something. And yeah, I look, the other thing too is that like we have to get more reporting on to what degree there was backsliding here or cold feet, because it certainly looked like they have a rally planned tonight when we're recording this in Pennsylvania, which seemed like it naturally might be to have the governor of Pennsylvania come on stage. And I'm sure he'll be there. I'm sure he'll
be a good soldier.
He'll be a good soldier and then probably hate her guts for the rest of his life. And then try to seek the nomination himself in 4 years or 8 years or whatever. But, them getting cold feet makes it more seem like maybe it was the Israel Jewish left bundle of stuff, right? But also like just as a tactician, and I'm not a tactician, more of a strategy guy, it seems like something wasn't handled well in how these issues were vetted, right? Because there were some pretty minor scandals of like, covering up a sexual harassment scandal and whatever, et cetera, that didn't seem to have a lot of there, but began to metastasize a little bit. And so like, I wonder if the Shapiro press people weren't very good and he should have been calling in more favors and had people agitating for him like Tim Walz had with like Nancy Pelosi and Bernie Sanders. And I don't think he played his hand very well. Which by the way is, reveals a little bit of information, maybe about what kind of a surrogate that he'd be potentially. Maybe there's some, totally speculating, maybe there's some ego there. And that ego combined with kind of Harris's feeling of like, yeah, I don't know if you want to have 2 stars on the ticket. Usually that's not how it works, but it's all pretty weird. The lack of consideration for Gretchen Whitmer, for example. I guess you don't want 2 women, but I'm not sure where that conventional wisdom even comes from. Like, who's the guy who's like, oh, I just need 1 man on the ticket, just 1. That's good enough for me. It's a little bit weird.
There's a funny line in Veep where the Selena Meyer character, it's floated to her to have 2 women on the ticket, and she says the American people work too hard for that kind of bullshit. And agree with you that Whitmer would be a formidable running mate. I think once again, you run into the issue of the upstaging issue. And also, I don't know if Whitmer wanted it. I haven't read reporting on it. Maybe she did, maybe she didn't. She might be one of those Dems that wants that clear runway in the future. Not sure. I'm not sure about it.
I assume people want this VP pick. I think this VP pick is kind of a no lose. We call it like a free roll in poker terms, where expectations are, or were at least, this may be changing, relatively low for the Harris campaign, right? You take over midstream, you start out behind in the polls, though now they've drawn into a slight lead in the polls. You're kind of asked to serve for the party. So it's kind of like I don't think, like Tim Kaine, for example, was the VP pick for Hillary. And because they were expected to win and didn't, people just got the icks and like never want to have anything to do with Tim Kaine again as a national figure. He's still a senator from Virginia, of course. With this, I mean, I don't know if it's Whitmer or Shapiro or something. I mean, Shapiro clearly did want the job by all accounts. If it's Whitmer and the ticket fails, then maybe people will be like, well, what if it was her at the top of the ticket? I think she should have been at the top of the ticket, and then they would have won. You just increase your chances of becoming the president so much by being the VP pick, Ethan, that like, unless you just want to top out at governor, which some people do. I mean, I think being president would be a terrible job, although I also think being governor would be a terrible job. You just having a lot of money handed to you for free, basically, right? Or just go write a book. You don't have to run for president. Your options are not unconstrained, right? So you can, get a bigger book advance or something, right? Or pivot somehow, or go run a university somewhere, or work for a corporate board and get paid a lot of money to do nothing. I mean, it just seems like it's money sitting there on the table. And I assume that 90% of people, if offered the job, would take it.
Yeah, she might have been a particular case. She seems like she's got political talent. That's not my judgment on how good Whitmer is as a governor. I've just seen her with her rapport and interviews, and she just seems like one of those people who's talented enough to win a nomination outright. So that was my assumption. I'm just not certain about it. One more difficult question on this before we get into the meat of this fascinating book and all these related topics that we could just talk about for days. You mentioned when it comes to making a pick like a Whitmer, that there is, in your words, this gross aspect of census category balancing that you see the parties doing. And I share that feeling. I don't like when census category is elevated over merit, but yet there is this realpolitik aspect of trying to present some sort of combination that appeals to different groups. And that often involves where somebody is from. If they're from a tipping point state, do you feel significantly better about such considerations being rooted in locationism versus census category? And if so, then why?
I mean, look, it's not like Vikings fans and Packers fans are best friends exactly. I'm not sure there's like kind of Walz does come across as very Midwestern. I'm not sure there's like a cross-border appeal. I mean, even the home state effects are relatively small. And Minnesota's a distinct personality type. It's very northern. It's Pennsylvania is more kind of the keystone. It's kind of in the middle of, well, not really in the middle of the country, but like in Pennsylvania, you are getting like a mix of like poor, rich, city, suburb, rural area, etc. So like his performance there is, I think, more of a tell than in the Minnesota, which is a little bit more eccentric potentially. But I don't know. No, it's all just conventional wisdom that has almost no like empirical backing. I mean, I think it's better than some recent VP picks. I mean, but again, by the way, both Harris and Biden were elevated by the fact that they were vice presidential picks, right? They are not once in a generation Obama, Reagan, Clinton politicians. Shapiro might be, maybe Whitmer is. I don't think Tim Walz is. He's 60 and had a good career. I don't think he's a once in a generation talent. And I guess it's true that maybe by definition, the once in a generation talents don't, I don't know what's because the sports show I keep going for it's like having maybe you don't want Steve Young as your backup or something like that, right? Although it's not exactly as though Harris is the Joe Montana of politics either.
But maybe that's the misaligned incentives, is that the Joe Montana is the Bill Walsh in these circumstances, in their authority. So it's a problem.
Yeah, and look, again, I think Democrats made this very smart risk-on decision to shove Biden out of the way, and then they made a risk-averse decision here. It's by far the less important of the two decisions, and I think it's within the margin of error. I mean, there are plausible facts you could learn about polling they did, or vetting problems, or their confidence about certain states that might affect the decision around the margin. But, this is typical Democratic risk aversion, I think.
Well, you're a better man than I am, because you mentioned it being the better decision, and you're correct about that. And it does seem evident that Biden was drawing dead. It does seem as though history has very quickly validated you, and you do not bring it up, Nate. You do not puff out your own chest. It's just going to be retconned. It's going to be memory hold. The unbelievable amounts of shit you were taking for telling them to make this move from being DOA to actually having a clear coin flip shot in this thing. So yes, congratulations to you, and I praise you. I praise you for your humility. But as I continue to butter you up, I will continue to butter you up. I didn't really get done with the buttering, because I do love this book, and I want to say something. I want to say something to people out there. You mentioned in the book that you became a meme that precedes you. It was an aside, and you probably use different phrasing, but I know what you mean. If you're listening to me right now, maybe you follow Nate's work, or maybe you've just heard of him and you think of him as the data guy or the election guy, the guy who's going to tell you who's probably going to win, the king of probability. It's not said often enough that you are an excellent writer. You're an excellent writer, man.
Thank you, Ethan. And a lot of it is getting reps in. I mean, I wrote every day for the book or the newsletter. I've probably written something, 320 of the last 365 days. And it's like any muscle that you build up over time. I appreciate that. So thank you very much.
Yeah. Well, it's just true. And there are these asides you have in this book that, to me, it seems like the most personal thing that you've written, that I don't necessarily even anticipate, but stick with me. I didn't exactly think that we would start this conversation about the book with this insight, but you mentioned getting to know Sam Bankman-Fried and your conversations, SBF, the how do I even describe SBF to somebody who didn't follow that whole crypto collapse? Because I don't want to overemphasize or call him a con artist. There's still some debate over the whole thing, but you mentioned encountering 3 different personalities of his, and I thought that was very insightful. And you also mentioned that I don't think he has multiple personality disorder. In a weird way, this very odd, disreputable guy, just from your description, was making me think about how everybody kind of has multiple personality disorder and is unreconciled and is contextually different with people. This is a bit of a ramble, but I remember I saw a judge sentencing a guy who'd done something terrible, and she was bringing up how he had been this charming, charismatic guy in the community with all these friends, and she was positing that he had done this in order to curry favor and obscure the terrible thing he was doing. And I remember talking about it with my wife, because she had known somebody who was very abusive but very charismatic with tons of friends, and we both concluded, I don't think he was doing the charismatic, fun guy stuff as a ruse. I think he was just that guy in that context with his work buddies.
Yep.
And he was this other guy in this other context. And I just thought it was so insightful. And I loved everything about SBF and going down that rabbit hole that was just not assuming too much and just trying to unpack and unravel what the hell happened here when this guy went up against this speculative bubble that he was powering.
I mean, look, I think he was a con artist, but one advantage of a book is that you have opportunities to paint a nuanced portrait of people, where you'll talk to the subject. I talked to Sam, 5 or 6 times, where you talk to other people about them. And then you can read third party source material, court transcripts, for example, in his case. And you try to paint a nuanced portrait, because successful people are complicated people. They're deeply weird people, especially the people that like are at the tail end of the bell curve where, Elon Musk is the richest person in the history of humanity out of whatever, like 50 billion people that have ever lived or something. By definition, he's got to be really weird, right? He's got to be pretty smart and he's got to be pretty lucky, but he's got to have some like freakish characteristics that put him way out there on the outlier, because the high variance skill sets are what is rewarded in Silicon Valley and other parts of the river. And so, I think that extends a little bit.
I just want to pause you right there. Sorry to do that, but can you just quickly, because it's so anchoring to your book, can you explain the metaphor that you just referred to with the river and the village?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Yes. That's my fault for not setting you up.
I'm a big geography kind of visual learner guy. So I make kind of maps in my head. So the river is a metaphorical place that consists of these people who are very competitive risk takers. So it kind of starts out in the world of poker that you can go upstream into Wall Street and Silicon Valley, or downstream into crypto and various kinds of degenerate, day trading and meme stocks and things like that. Or all the way upstream into the more intellectual foundations of it for things like effective altruism that might be a little too far upstream. But, those are people trying to calculate the expected value of like, what is a dog's life worth relative to a human life? Or how do we most effectively give to charity? Or how do we minimize the risk of nuclear war, etc.? I began to detect a lot of commonalities in the people in these different fields. I mean, it started out in poker, like literally the first thing I did. First flight I took post-pandemic is I flew to like the Hard Rock Seminole Casino in Florida, which is a amazing shit show as a casino in Florida, as you expect it would be. And there are record numbers of people after being cooped up for a year playing this World Poker Tour event. I wound up cashing for some small amount of money, but I'm like, these are my people, man. Not the locked up in COVID people. These are my people who are, they can't wait to get back to Florida and play poker in awkward conditions. They're like glass dividers, and like people are supposed to be wearing masks. Some are and some aren't. It's very constrained in some ways, but there was something there of a certain type of person who crosses being extremely analytical with extremely competitive. And that personality type in a world that's kind of determined more and more by algorithms and kind of the quants have won, the people on the far right tail of the success curve and the people that on the far left tail, like SBF, are going to have this risk-taking gene. I say gene somewhat euphemistically, but I do think that there's something innate in people, that some people have a desire to like press the button, touch the third rail, gamble, etc., take risks. There seems to be something innate in people that drives that.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I do think that competitiveness is often innate. And Steve Kerr, I remember interviewing him about how he would just throw these horrible tantrums as a little leaguer that embarrassed his parents. His parents were these professors, these intellectuals. They didn't really care much about sports, and they weren't telling him, look, you better win, like many little league dads do, and put this pressure on him. But it was just in him to be psychotically competitive. I do think that it's often fairly innate. It's often intrinsic. I think, okay, I'm going to give you a broad question. It's a very cliche question because you spend a lot of time on poker in this book. Is poker a metaphor for life, or is it a metaphor for something else?
I wouldn't say it's a metaphor for life. I'd say it captures uniquely well certain types of decision making where you're blending analytical skills with people skills. Or people reading and people skills are slightly different things, I think. And like, I think that's correlated with having a skill set that you need to succeed in business. And, it's good with other things too. I mean, metaphorically, decision making under stress and under uncertainty, like, I think that helps a lot. If I'm covering some election night in 2020, I am like on ABC News live on air, and our model had Joe Biden. This is not 2016 when we had the race fairly close. I mean, we had Joe Biden as a 90-10 favorite. And first results come in from Florida and states like that, and it begins to look like 2016 all over again. It turns out that Florida was a little bit of an outlier in that election, and that Biden, of course, wound up winning. But I'm like, okay, I'm on national TV, and here's this event happening that like could be really bad for me reputationally, but you're kind of imagining yourself in some big, like World Series of Poker event or something where you just you lost a big pot or something happened to damage your stack, but you're still in the tournament and you still have to like play your hand the best that you can. And so that kind of simulacrum, or I don't know how you say that word, of risk taking is I think that's quite valuable, right? Especially if you're like actually gambling for money that's actually meaningful to you, which sometimes I do, for poker at least. You only get so many reps. I mean, the book also gets to some stuff that's relevant to being in the zone for sports psychology in terms of when we are under stress, our bodies react differently. We actually are triggering very powerful kind of afterburner systems when we're under stress. And your body will know. I talked to a guy named John Coates in the book who wrote a book called The Hour Between Dog and Wolf, which he was a guy who was an academic, went to Wall Street, became a equities derivatives trader or something for Deutsche Bank, I think. And he's like, these people who are traders are really freaking weird, right? They have physically weird reactions to risk, and you can see the amount of like testosterone they have, and they're supposed to be hyper rational, but clearly there's something different there. And so what he did is he left Wall Street to study the neurology basically of traders, literally like to kind of wire them up and see how the different chemical compounds evolved over the course of a day. So it's fascinating. And what he found is there's actually a lot of overlap between being a trader and athletic performance. That traders actually, like champion athletes, have like a high difference between their resting heart rate and their heart rate under stress, but they actually perform better when they're under stress because like they find some element of being in the zone where, like literally it's kind of what it is, right? You can go into a panic state if you begin to start to have your elevated heart rate and start to have things process a little bit more. You might have time dilation. Things go a little bit more slowly, or for other people more quickly, or you feel like you're maybe on some drugs of some kind, right? It's kind of, some people love that situation. And I found more and more that when I play high stakes poker, I'm starting to have like a little bit of a reaction where I feel like I maybe have some mastery of that, and probably objectively your performance has fallen off, but relatively speaking, other people's performance falls off more maybe. That's quite addicting, and I think has like direct consequences for people who enjoy other types of stressful situations.
Man, there's so much there. Because I've learned over time in life that you have to acknowledge it's happening. You can't try to silence it. That anxiety, that adrenaline, it will get the better of you. I actually think it's good advice to people who might be on a bad drug trip. I think the worst thing you can do if you're on a bad drug trip is to just try to silence and suppress. I think you actually have to just ride it out and understand that it's happening. And often suffering delivers a positive payload in the other direction, and endorphins. And there's that anxiety at the beginning. I've talked with many athletes who did not perform nervously, but they had those butterflies that I can remember from high school basketball that I really didn't enjoy. But the only way to get through it is to channel, to, as a director might tell an actor, use it. That's all you can do. And I think with reps, people just get better at using it and directing that energy. But it's no mystery why people freak out. I mean, it is literally stressful. That's what's happening.
No, and look, if you make it through the ranks of youth sports and high school sports and college sports, the professional levels, I mean, you don't have like too many outright chokers. I mean, I guess now and then you have a Ben Simmons or somebody who has enough talent combined with enough stress management skills where they make the league and then kind of fail repeatedly. But yeah, in sports, you're selecting for that and training for that in things like the military. So most of the book is about quantitative risk takers, but not all. There's a chapter with physical risk takers. So I talked to a former NFL player. I talked to an astronaut. I talked to H.R. McMaster, who's a former star general in the military. Talked to an explorer who trained fighter pilots at the Top Gun Academy. And it's actually remarkably similar, this kind of battling under stress and coolness under pressure and executing the game plan, right? The thing I heard repeatedly was don't try to be a hero. If you can execute the basic X's and O's blocking and tackling, then A, you're ahead of 95% of people who are freaking out. And B, that opens up mental bandwidth. If you do want to get more creative or more mavericky or whatever else, or try to, be a superhero, but you get the basics down first through practice and repetition and reps. And yeah, I'm a much bigger believer now in clutch performance in sports after studying these poker players and talking to people like John Coates and writing this book. I used to think that stuff was bullshit, and now I think it's probably real.
But it's real in a very counterintuitive way, I believe. And you capture it in the book. I believe you might have been quoting Bill Walsh, how in these pressure situations, it's not that the clutch team or player rises to the occasion. It's that they don't come unraveled. And you hear that in military training, that people reduce to the level of their training. They don't get better. They just fall back on it. And I think that's counterintuitive to people because we're deciding heroes and losers. And so you think, oh my God, it's the moment. I'm really rising up to capture this high leverage moment. But if we are talking about Bill Walsh and we're talking about his teams, that drive against the Bengals that Joe Montana orchestrated, I think, is a fantastic example of this. Because if you watch that famous drive in the Super Bowl, it's not any sort of big throw through the tightest window. It's just little dinks and dunks, just doing your job calmly and not trying to do too much. And in the end, in a pressure situation, that often carries the day when a lot of other people are panicking.
Or, Tom Brady, 28-3 comeback, the Patriots versus the Falcons. It's just executing. They had little margin of error. They had to execute 15 plays in a row correctly, and they execute 15 plays in a row correctly. None of which are that remarkable on their own, but that consistency of execution, having systems in place, having training, is very important.
I would agree with that. And I think there are excellent life lessons in this book. In addition to you talking about underworld characters that I cackled when I was reading this book in Tahoe when I saw a chapter begin with the sports bettor Spanky. I was just, this is ridiculous. This book is written for me. This is insane that Spanky, the sports bettor who frequently gets kicked out of casinos while putting it all on video, is featured in this book. I loved the parts about sports betting for obvious reasons. I think you discussed something that's become a bit of a theme on my site. I think a lot of people believe that you just can't beat the house. You just can't do it. They know more. They're smarter. And what you did in the book is you actually explained what the house was, what's behind the curtain of one of these sports books. And it turns out that it's fallible human beings just try to do their best guesswork. And the tricky thing about sports betting, and I love that you talked about NBA betting, because I once had a column back in 2019 where I picked against the spread, and I did it after doing a bunch of picks before I made it public. And if I do say so myself, I had success. But as you relay, I think I wrote this down about how people just assume that it's harder than what it is. Got them so prepared. Yes, the section is, you said people go, oh, it's so hard to beat Vegas. Those guys are sharp. No, it's really not so hard. It's really not so hard if you study and treat it like a job to win at sports betting. The only problem, of course, is if you're successful, they don't let you do it anymore. And that's the trick of it all.
Yeah, I mean, beating NFL closing point spreads, totals, and money lines. And I know your audience is probably pretty sports betting aware, but I mean, the line just before kickoff, that is nearly impossible. Billy Walters, he's also in the book, maybe the best sports bettor in, kind of modern history, can do it, but very, very few people can. And you can't just take like a model off the shelf and outfox the 4.5% cut that the house takes. However, if you're betting lines early, when it's just some like nerd in a boiler room coming up with the numbers, or if you're choosing the best line between a number of different sites, like getting half a point, meaning that you get a line at, -4.5 instead of -5 or whatnot, like that actually is enough to, in basketball or football, to eat up most of the house's edge. So if you can find that half point, you don't have that much further to go from slightly losing to slightly winning. And the fact that you have literally, you go to like open up whatever the Yankees are playing out of the Angels tonight. There are literally 200 or 300 bets that you can make on that game, I'm sure, at FanDuel or DraftKings, home run props for Anthony Volpe or whatever else, right? And so to find like one of thousands of bets between dozens of sites that you can make, and these lines fluctuate throughout the day, like that's not that hard if you can bet freely at will. Of course, what happens is that if you're any good, then they'll limit how much you can bet. I mean, I've been limited by DraftKings, by less so by FanDuel, severely by MGM, severely by Resorts World Bet, severely by WinBet. So credit to Caesars, by the way, for not having limited me yet. Them and I guess Bet Rivers are the ones where I can actually still bet full limits. But yeah, it's kind of a rigged game where if you're any good, then they kind of take your ability away to bet. And of course, like, that only solves half the problem because I can, of course, not that I'd ever do this, but of course, let's say there's a guy in my poker game who is a degenerate sports bettor who has very large limits, but we're friendly, right? And I say, you know what? I really like the Mavericks tonight, -4. Can you put $10,000 on that? And then we'll go 50-50 on it. That's very hard to prevent. It probably violates the terms of service of the site. So be very careful about doing that. And again, you don't want to get in any court situation involving gambling because a typical judge and jury is A, not going to understand much of it, and B, not going to be very sympathetic to somebody who's like, seen as a sports bettor. They'll confuse being a bookmaker, which is illegal in most states, with just betting. So be very careful about doing that. But like, information has a tendency to flow into the people who are in a position to make money with it. And, having these different limits where one guy can bet $1 million on a game and one guy can only bet $10 seems like not a very sustainable, robust kind of long-term business model. And this whole thing about inside information, right? I was at the Las Vegas Summer League, I guess last year. So 2023, I'm often out there for July is the World Series of Poker plus Summer League. So in non-election years, especially, I'm out there quite a bit. And I see there's some team executive, 2 rows in front of me at some Summer League game. And I see some giant text. Oh, OG Anunoby is going to be traded to the Knicks, which was premature because this is summer and he wasn't traded until I forget when it was exactly, mid-year, December or whatever it was. But like, that's pretty valuable information potentially, right? And when you're allowing people to bet on things like who the draft pick will be. I mean, or even who the vice president will be, I suppose, right? If you have inside knowledge, by the way, that Tim Walz pick, prediction markets were on that thing early. There was a big shift about 15 minutes this morning before he was chosen. Someone read some flight tracker number or someone had some type of tip and yeah, the information has a tendency when it can make people money, then information tends to flow to people that learn how to make money with it.
I'm the sort of sucker who is going, maybe I want to get Bashir at 1 cent. Maybe there could be some sort of change of heart when it's difficult to make the decision and I could make a lot of that money back. I'm curious because you talked about your process of being an NBA bettor. And I'm wondering, what did you learn about the league? Because I felt like when I did it, I learned things about the league. Unfortunately, there's no free lunch in nature. So I was successful, but it wasn't because I'm a goodwill hunting genius. It's because I worked my ass off. And eventually my boss at The Athletic at the time, Tim Kawakami, in conjunction with my wife, came to me and said, you've got to start writing about the Warriors. Those articles do better, and you're not going to be watching 4 games a night. Yeah. But I felt like I learned the extent to which defense is undervalued. My rule for myself was that every pick I made, I needed to identify the market inefficiency. I wasn't always correct about it, but it was a way to keep me honest and get me out of that whole, I'm feeling this team. I had to articulate it. And there were other aspects too, where I felt as though the centers had a kind of a rock, paper, scissors against one another, where certain centers dominated others. And that was an important factor. And they quit earlier. It's the stereotype. They're a little less competitive than the smaller guys. What did you learn about basketball from making these picks that maybe the public or the casual fans might not know?
This might not be surprising, but how much of a grind the regular season is.
Yeah.
I was mostly betting based on it's some combination of shopping for the best lines, which you always have to do in sports betting. Plus, I have a model. Plus, just being a huge NBA nerd and having opinions of my own. So I did very, very, very well, like a huge heater at the start of the season, and then kind of lost it all back, and then had a huge heater right at the trade deadline, and then lost most of it back, and wound up with a 0.1% ROI or some ridiculously embarrassingly below minimum wage per hour profit margin, basically. But, it's hard to be positive anything in sports betting. But like the reason it did well in those times is because that's when you gained a more advantage from having accurate player valuations because all the players were changing teams, right? And that's something which the models are good at. The regular season grind of like trying to psych out, like, when is a team going to be motivated? And when aren't they? And then trying to suss out injury reports, right? Where it's like you're looking, you want that like shoot around video and the guy who's questionable. Oh, does Trae Young look good? He looks pretty good in shoot around, I think, right? Maybe I should bet that. Oh, the line already moved. It's too late. But like if you have like a good injury model, and in the NBA where like Luka or Jokic or Giannis or whatever else makes like a 8 or 9 point difference in the point spread, these like heliocentric superstars, then that's kind of all that really matters. It kind of swamps everything else. And so, I mean, like Spanky, who we talked about before, has like 3 guys who just look at injury data for him, and they decode different tweets, and they understand how, Joel Embiid will always be listed as questionable by Daryl Morey for every game in a row under certain circumstances. And when will he play and when won't he? And there's politics with the league and the 2 all-star sitting thing and everything like that. How much of a grind that was, and then how different the playoffs are, where the playoffs are, the playoffs I think are much harder to use with any type of model because it's, experience matters a lot more in the playoffs than people realize. But yeah, just, pouring through injury report after injury report and trying to decontextualize different tweets from different beat reporters was not a very pleasant experience.
Yeah. Being a gambler seems like a fairly lonely existence in many ways, and a real grind, as appealing hypothetically or theoretically as it is. This does remind me, though, you see the people in the NBA trying to figure this out. One of my favorite sites when I was a beat writer was just being on the floor level in a pregame. I'm watching a star player whose status was in doubt go through his warm-up and just looking at all the Warriors assistant coaches standing on the opposing free throw line and just staring at him and trying to decode how healthy is he and is he going to play, and then making the conclusion, nope, he's out, and yelling at the video guy, sprint back, cut up the video differently, this guy's not playing. And you see them making those judgments on the occupational level as opposed to on the gambling level. I'm going to jump around. I just wrote questions about things I found interesting about the book, and there are so many topics. So I apologize to anybody if they expected some sort of orderly progression down this here river of ours. I found it interesting as an artistic choice, Nate, because you mentioned that poker players are overwhelmingly male, that your hypothetical poker player was a she when you would talk about this, idea of a poker player making a choice. What is behind that? I'm not trying to accuse you of being woke, Nate. I'm not trying to criticize the choice. Yeah. I'm just interested in the artistic choice of why. Is this like in Street Fighter? Everybody liked playing. Was it Ryu? I'm trying to remember. It was a popular character. What is behind that artistic choice?
I mean, I think we should have more women poker players. There are some wonderful women poker players, including those that are featured in the book. And yeah, I'm not super woke. I'm not super duper unwoke. But look, I think there are differences on average between the genders, but I think in some ways women might have the better half of the deal as far as poker goes. I mean, having what I call strategic empathy, where you can like size somebody up. Stereotypically women are actually pretty good at that, and they may have better emotional control than men do. So we should have more women poker players. But yeah, look, I have to reconcile with the fact that in this world that I call the river, it's very male. Parts of it are also very white and or Asian. Poker is actually a little bit more diverse ethnicity and racially wise, but it's very male. It's 95 or 97% male at a typical tournament. And like, I don't want to like ignore that. I don't want to shy away from it too much. I want to, you know, I also don't think that you need like a white guy pontificating a whole lot about like race and things like that. But yeah, there are a couple of sections where I tackle the gender discrimination in poker, and then, you know, racial and gender discrimination in Silicon Valley. And then I'm also conscientious of like, of the fact that like, you know, maybe you lean like a little bit heavier into thinking about the representativeness of the characters in the book. But, you know, that might make it like 80-20 instead of 95-5, right? I think it would be misrepresented to say, oh, 50-50. And it just so happens that every one other person you meet is like a, you know, a woman in this world that's very male, and the maleness is important to the social dynamics of things like, you know, Wall Street Bets, that Reddit community, for example, or the poker community. There are things that are like specifically, you know, competitiveness when men compete against one another is a particular shade of competitiveness that you experience in the river. So I just have to, you know, describe that topic. Well, someone who thinks there actually is discrimination against like women founders, I believe. It's not me being woke. I think it's like empirically the case, right? But, you know, it's also the case that probably men on average are better than women at some things. That's also empirically the case. But I'm just trying to strike the right balance.
Well, I should add before I get corrected that apparently the female Street Fighter character everybody likes to play with is Chun-Li, and I have made Ryu a woman. I don't believe that's the case. Perhaps I am woke in doing that. Yeah. I'm not sure about it. Yeah, you listed the 5 reasons why poker is disproportionately male. I felt like the reason that immediately came to mind for me wasn't mentioned in the 5. It was a little bit orthogonally. There is some overlap to what you were saying, and males struggling to have community and friendships, and poker being a way for that. It just seems like the poker lifestyle, from the outsider's perspective, seems pretty lonely. And for whatever reason, lonely lifestyles tend to be taken on more so by men. And there's been a lot of literature on this, and a trucker is more likely to be a male. And that was one of my interpretations. When I was reading about the lifestyle, about the river in that respect, I was thinking, Nate seems very comfortable with this kind of lifestyle, but I feel like there's a little bit of bleakness there and a little bit of harshness there to be one's own gambler. The song "The Gambler" depicts that kind of harsh life. You got to know when to hold him. You got to know when to fold him. The guy crushing out the cigarette and his very rugged lifestyle, and, you know, telling the younger man about it. Do you think there's something to that there's a loneliness to that lifestyle? And maybe that's part of the gender dynamic.
I think that observation is correct, that like there's a certain type. I mean, I haven't thought about the gender part of it, but yeah, there is like, it's a grind. I mean, I talked to Jeff Ma, who was on the MIT blackjack team, and of course hosts his own podcast with another sports bettor named Rufus Peabody. And if you've seen the movie 21, which if you're listening to this podcast with Ethan and I, you maybe have, that makes it seem like it's a wild party, right? You go to the club, right? And you have all these women around you, and then you're kind of playing blackjack for $1,000 a hand, and you always win, and you're day drinking and taking drugs and things like that. That's not how it really was. I mean, this was long enough ago where like there were barely even nightclubs in Las Vegas, right? Instead, you're going oftentimes to like a casino in Elgin, Illinois, where you're trying to avoid detection from the corrupt local cops, because even though what you're doing is totally legal, maybe they get played off and will tailgate you for a bit if you leave with a big jackpot or things like that. And you're playing all night until there's a dealer change, and then you're kind of taking the red eye home back to Boston and kind of, you know, going to class on 1 hour sleep. It's a grind. In a poker tournament, literally, you keep playing until everyone else is eliminated. the best run I've had in the World Series Poker main event was last year, where I ended up in like 89th or 79th or somewhere in the high two digits out of 10,000 people that started. And you kind of begin to feel like survivor's guilt. All the people have gone home. All your friends that were in the tournament have gone home, maybe left town. They're like starting to like board up the venue by this point. The activity is like dwindling down at this point. It's a kind of very solitary lifestyle. Now, for me, I like it because, 80% of the time I'm talking a lot and writing a lot. I'm kind of very in my like verbal headspace. I mean, I'm in New York. I have a reasonably active social life, I guess, right? I have a partner who is he's a talker. I'm kind of a quieter. He likes to talk, and we like to talk everything through. So I love the idea for like a few weeks out of the year, I can go to some poker tournament. And if I want, just go to a hotel room, play poker, have as much conversation as I want or not, right? Maybe go with a friend to dinner, or maybe just get dinner on your own. And like, I like to have that solitude, when I don't get enough of it usually, but to only have that, I think would be pretty difficult. And if I'm being honest, I'm not sure how happy and well-rounded even some of the more successful, objectively poker players are. I think they're a little bit melancholy sometimes.
Phil Hellmuth seems happy in his own weird way, at least by your depiction. At least happy with himself, quite pleased with himself. Man, there's so many places to take this, so many directions to take this. I was so pleasantly surprised when you wrote about the effective altruists, Nate. I saw you at that Manifest conference. Oh, yeah. And I very briefly, I asked you about the Celtics. Everybody else was badgering you with election questions. I wanted Celtics information from you. And it's just one of those scenes, that conference. I can't even describe the campus. It's just seems almost heavenly. It's a really cool campus, but everybody looks very hippie-ish. And it's just this scene that you could imagine Tom Wolfe and Joan Didion fighting each other to describe first, this weird West Coast cultural vanguard. But thankfully, we had you. We had you there on the inside and the outside of this whole thing to try to explain to us how a conference obsessed with probability and prediction is also attracting people who are, I don't know, have strange habits of their love life. And Ayla there is a rationalist superstar who famously did a statistically chronicled orgy, a birthday orgy. I mean, you start describing this sort of thing to a normal person, and you sound, to use a word of the moment, quite weird. But I'm glad you were there, and I don't even have a good beginning question other than, what the hell is that scene?
No, exactly. Because, and the fact that like you're there, I mean, it's so like that conference, which I've been to twice now. It's only occurred twice, is a very literal manifestation of the river, right? You have poker players and hedge fund people and just kind of various weird, probably somewhere on the spectrum people. And you have people leading experimental lifestyles, and it's kind of hippy dippy in some ways, but you probably also have some like super rich people who were making a killing in markets and things like that, and people pitching like startup ideas. And like, it's also kind of small, right? It's just one kind of campus so-called in Berkeley. And I'm like, I fucking know, like maybe not half the people here, but probably 20%, right? And I met half of these people in the last year. So that conference was like a validation of the fact that there is a certain type of person that are attracted to one another, and that like, I think are not written about in a fair way often by the mainstream media, because they're kind of seen as like a little bit cringe, right? They're nerdy. It is pretty male and pretty white a lot of times. So they're not kind of like of the moment if you're doing in the New York Times style section or whatnot. They rub politics people the wrong way because they tend to be a little bit, I think politically incorrect is actually the more better term to use there instead of unwoke, right? They will just kind of like, they don't really have filters. So they'll talk about anything, including like race and genetics and gender stuff that like even I avoid, and yet they all kind of get along, and it's deeply weird. I was happy to be a fly on the wall for a lot of this stuff and bring a fair representation of the scene, which again, by no means, I mean, in some ways, the most important character in the book is Sam Bankman-Fried, and not to spoil it, but the presentation of him is not very sympathetic because I don't think it deserves to be sympathetic, right? So I'm letting you in, but giving you like an honest portrayal of this weird and wonderful, but sometimes very over self-indulgent world.
Yeah, and it's a world that cannot be dismissed, I believe, as fringe. I mean, a lot of these people do have influence, and even if they don't have direct influence, they are. Scott Alexander is somebody people with money and power read. You know, ideas from him are informing other ideas that can potentially happen at scale. And I look at certain communities that you can dismiss as totally fringe and of no import. I mean, loosely connected with that community, I believe, is the crew around Curtis Yarvin. And in theory, there shouldn't be much overlap, but there is kind of some overlap. And I've heard dismissals of Yarvin's ideas on monarchy and everything else as a form of LARPing. And I think, yeah, that can kind of make some sense. But then again, history tends to be changed by just people at the long tail, smart people, motivated. I mean, you could have said the same thing about the Bolsheviks. So I don't want to dismiss a lot of people in this Bay Area milieu because they look kooky as having no impact on what's going to happen. Trends often start right there.
No, one thing, you know, I met more billionaires in writing this book than I'm sure I met in my entire life. And like, billionaires are weirdos, right? That shouldn't be surprising. We're kind of bringing that full circle a little bit. But I was surprised how kind of small these communities are. And also kind of, you know, how different the vibes in like kind of Twitter or mainstream media are. It's like people can hate on me on Twitter, but like, you know, I have billionaires answering my phone calls and giving me these extremely candid interviews because my thought process is somehow closer to their thought process, and or they feel like I'm not going to be a typical biased liberal journalist who will just trash them. I mean, again, I think some of the portraits of some of these people are harsh but fair. But I do think they're fair, and there's room in a long book to let people speak in their own words and on their own terms, and to show people instead of telling is an old writer's adage, and not be too heavy handed with things, and recognize that also like this world's kind of like zany and fun sometimes. I mean, you know, one very generous reviewer kind of said there's a little bit of a gonzo journalism, Hunter S. Thompson aspect to it, especially if I'm like out in the Bahamas, you know, 5 days before SBF is arrested, hang out like in a darkening condo with him. I think I got just very like 99th percentile luck for picking some of these topics in all these worlds that kind of wound up blowing up, you know, crypto and AI and even sports betting to some degree. I mean, obviously, like you see a couple of moves ahead and you're steering things a bit differently. I mean, the original book was going to have this very long, tedious, no doubt, chapter on COVID that got cut down to like half a page or something. But I felt I got really lucky to have a seat at the table for so much of this stuff.
Well, I think your career helped you get into these scenes that maybe would have been harder in the past. And you do have access to these fascinating people. Some of the Elon Musk stories in there I found to be so entertaining. The one about the way he played poker, where it was basically double or nothing until he won, and then he walks away. And this strange aspect of his persona where it's almost like he doesn't even feel risk. You have that scene where he's in the car with Peter Thiel many years ago, and their McLaren flips over, nearly killing them, but they walk away unscathed. And that's a history hinge point right there, but one on which Musk seems to reflect on very little. Just incredible access. Really enjoyed those portraits.
I appreciate that. And I didn't talk to Elon, I should say. We exchanged DMs once, but nothing substantive. But so we kind of played like a little bit of a waiting for Godot role in the book, I guess, where it's kind of like he's the kind of, his absence is interesting, but also there was a very detailed biography of him by Walter Isaacson called Elon Musk that came out about a year ago. And so that was very helpful. It was kind of like, because he hung out with Elon for 2 years, and it's almost like an autobiography. I think it you know, the critique is that it lacks a certain critical distance about it, but at the same time, I know a lot of people in Elon's orbit, and I think I understand how people think. So if you're listening to this and you're like, hey, I'm a member of the Village, and I don't like Elon Musk, and I don't like Peter Thiel, and I don't like Mark Andreessen, people like that, I'm at least going to give you like an honest cut on how they think, because the stereotypes are often pretty lazy and wrong. And it's partly because I have that mindset myself. I mean, I'm a pretty risk tolerant guy, I guess, and I've been a practitioner in some of these things. So it's a little bit of a tell-all memoir, a little bit of reporting, and then a little bit of more narrative explainer stuff. It's kind of like 3 books in one, basically.
Yeah, and that's what I want. I want dispassionate portrayals of how they think. I know Kara Swisher was interviewed in your book, but I haven't liked some of her portrayals of the tech people because it almost seems like it's not how they would view themselves. Maybe you could say, hey, this is how I view you, but this is how you view you, and come to some sort of, I don't know, meeting point. If I think about Andreessen, I don't think everything about his politics is rooted in trying to make society worse. I believe that he thinks communism, however he defines it, is a huge problem, and he's trying to make things better by his own understanding. Actually, I'm reminded of this. He had a quote that made me laugh a bit, and we can relate it to the effective altruists and the utilitarians, and your takes on why you are not necessarily a utilitarian or an effective altruist. And this is the Andreessen tweet that I'll use as a prompt. Utilitarianism is bad. It encourages mortal men to play God at levels of complexity that they can't possibly comprehend. It should be banned for the greater good. I thought that was...
I mean, some of these people are... Yeah. Some of these people, you mentioned Phil Hellmuth, poker player. I think some of these people start playing a character maybe as a kind of social defense mechanism, and then they never get out of the character. You know what I mean? I mean, I think Andreessen's actually a pretty funny guy. But people in the river also sometimes have a habit to troll a little bit. They like to provoke. They like to kind of experiment, kick the hornet's nest, and see what happens afterward. So sometimes people are saying things that are like a little bit tongue in cheek. But sometimes you start to believe the tongue in cheekness after a while, and you kind of become that character.
I'm wondering, to talk about another character in this milieu, Yudkowsky, who is an AI doomer. You get into AI doomerism. What's the probability of life ending for us all? The apocalypse brought about by these hyper intelligent machines. Is he logical in having this almost reverse Pascal's wager, this temporal Pascal's wager of believing that AI is going to kill us all? Because if he's correct, then there's no validation to be had and there's no victory. So is that a logical call that he is making because it's his view of reality, or is it illogical to predict something and say it will almost certainly happen that you'll never derive any benefit from because we'll all be dead?
I mean, he can have like a bit of a savior complex. Although I like him actually. He's someone that it took me a little while to warm up to. He's kind of gruff and not somebody who's going to like, he's not super how's the weather kind of conversation person necessarily. At one point he was like so convinced about AI doom being inevitable, near 100%, literally, that he was just like wrote a post like, "Oh, we should just like die with dignity." You know what I mean? And he became like depressed. And I think, actually I shouldn't make a clinical diagnosis, but like, I'm sure he found it depressing to believe that like we were all going to die, and like left the Bay Area to move to Seattle or something like that. And then when I saw him the second time at the Manifold conference, this is, I guess, the previous Manifold conference, the one I saw you at, Ethan, he was excited because the probability of doom had gone down to like only 98%. So now there's a 2% chance that we avoid doom, and therefore it's worth fighting for and trying to persuade people that we should avoid overly aggressive acceleration on AI development. Even with him, I'm not entirely sure how much he's trying to warn people versus how much he like literally bet on that. If in some cosmic sense that, I mean, first of all, some of these people just really care a lot about being right for rightness' sake, right? That might be kind of a, Asperger's syndrome adjacent tendency where it might just be something where just some people are kind of wired that way, I think. But But, for example, and I consult, by the way, for Polymarket, which is a pay market competitor. But Manifold, which is a play market site, also has pretty good pricing because people just care a lot about reputation and about being right in this community. And they're kind of gamifying this thing a little bit. And, their prices are pretty good too, for the most part. So yeah, I don't think Eliezer is necessarily playing like a deeply strategic game, although I do think he feels like it can't hurt to exaggerate. I don't know. I had very different conversations with him. And the second conversation, he seemed a lot more strategic about like, yeah, maybe it's kind of a conditional prediction that if we don't change things, then 98% chance of doom, but we could change things and therefore it's conditional prediction, if that makes sense. It's a little bit like the Biden thing, right? If Biden doesn't drop out, then Trump's going to win, but maybe Biden will drop out.
Yeah, that seems like a more, at least psychologically tenable position to hold if you want to be able to put one foot in front of the other and continue to have a normal existence. What do you make, because you mentioned it, what do you make of the EAs being disproportionately childless? Is this just pop psychology that I might look at this and go that this is some sort of misplaced concern that would be channeled in one direction that's getting externalized, or is there something else going on?
So I think some of them kind of rather pretentiously think that, well, it takes X amount of time to raise a child and I can create more utility in the world by like donating my time toward effective charities, which can save, 30 lives in Africa, in Mozambique or something, or Sri Lanka, in the time that I'll be raising my child. And therefore I'm being altruistic and benevolent for the world. I think that's part of it. By the way, it's notable that the VCs, the venture capitalists, mostly do have kids. Even though kind of stereotypically people who are very busy and hairy don't, it's kind of seen as a black mark on you. Even if you're like a gay VC, they still also they adopt kids even. So it's very different in the effective altruism community where it's, I think partly some of them think that the world's going to end. Partly they think they get more utility out of their time by doing other things. And partly it's that they are, they're the part of the river that overlaps most heavily with the village, right? The EAs are 13-1 Democratic over Republican. And they also can be kind of like political in how they communicate. When I talk to like Peter Singer, who is one of the founding philosophers of effective altruism, older guy at Princeton, very interesting dude, very interesting books. But I'm like, what about immigration? Wouldn't that do net good to have people migrate to like a more prosperous country? And he's like, well, I don't know if it enables radical populists like Donald Trump, then maybe not. I'm like, I don't quite understand, so we have to protect our borders, even though someone in Africa is just as important as someone in New Jersey or whatever. I mean, that seems like a little bit complicated. And so they're the ones who, again, that's where you have that river village overlap a bit is in part of the community.
Yeah, this is one of the reasons why I don't subscribe to the utilitarian philosophy or the EA, and maybe it's just for expediency reasons where life is just so complicated. I remember Janssen, the guy who developed all the pharmaceutical miracles. I remember reading in Sam Quinonez's book, The Least of Us, and he detailed all the incredible drugs and how many lives that he saved with his inventions, but he also came up with what eventually became fentanyl. And so that was meant to help people, but it wasn't so predicted that it would break containment and wreak the sort of havoc it wreaked. And I don't know if you added up all the lives he saved against all the lives ended by fentanyl, what the tally is ultimately. But that's just one example that came to mind extemporaneously of it's just so complicated. It's so hard to know. And to try to price it in or to try to put what is the value of one animal versus one human, I just tap out. I understand why other people think these things through, but I just find it, I find it way too difficult to sort through to live according to that kind of thinking. Yeah,
look, it's easy to build a bad election model or a bad sports model, and I've built some bad ones in my life, believe me. But at least in those forms of gambling, then you're putting money on the line, and so you pay a price for incorrect modeling about the world. And in EAs, you kind of don't. So there's this irony that like the EAs probably see themselves as more virtuous and like the dirty gamblers and hedge funders and Wall Streeters and technologists and whatever else. But the thing that people like actually gamble for a living actually have is that they have skin in the game and they have some degree of like street smarts. And so like a Sam Bankman-Fried, for example, is a familiar archetype to someone who plays poker or makes sports bets, and an archetype that we would be skeptical of. It's like we've seen a lot of smart kids like Sam. He's got to prove it over the long term and be able to engage in a deeper conversation and not just talk at 500 words a minute and not really actually land anywhere. So having that skeptical little bit of street smarts. I mean, we're not talking about the most street smart people in the world, Ethan. I mean, the most street smart people in the world probably go work for Goldman Sachs, or I don't know what they do, probably start a business or whatever else, right? But the combination of very strong analytical skills with medium strong social skills, and a very, very good bullshit detector. If you lack the bullshit detector, then you're going to get entrapped by bad models sometimes and by people who proselytize something and can't actually back it up.
I liked how in your book you talked about how a lot of people who were taken in by SBF were not fools. They were some of the sharpest people there were. And so the idea that this reveals them to be fools or frauds is maybe not thinking things completely through. How much time do you have left? I want to just calibrate my down the home stretch question.
Yeah, I should probably go. I have to run the model for today and then do a bunch of stuff. So you want to go, I mean, it's 3:16, so 15 minutes or 14 minutes or whatever would be best.
That's perfect. I just want to calibrate it. And we thank you for being so generous with your time. To bring it to the poker politics analogy, you tweeted recently that Trump was reminding you of a poker player who had gone on tilt. The Kamala campaign was gaining steam. He was getting increasingly wild. I think you might have said this in the aftermath of the NABJ appearance that he had, where he was talking about Kamala not being authentically black, or however he phrased it. And it had this kind of that circumstance, it almost feels like it's got that Trumpian wildness where there's a greased pig on stage and there's a, somebody going to grab the pig. The pig's gone wild. It's got that feeling to it. But my reaction to that tweet was, it always feels like he's playing poker on tilt. He always seems tilted, and he's had this remarkably successful political career. So what do you make of that? Do you think that sometimes he's playing the game well and sometimes he's playing it poorly? Is there something else to explain the overall, strictly speaking, political success?
I mean, I think Trump has a good real estate developer's mindset where he can detect property is valued. I mean, he explores territory. The notion that like, okay, what if I actually run against establishment in 2016 and he defeated, what was it, 16 or 17 other candidates, like legitimately, that was pretty impressive by saying, yeah, actually people hate the Paul Ryan, Mitt Romney people, and they hate the Bushes, and I can make a war hero like John McCain. I can even denigrate that because it's fun and naughty and we're realigning the electorate a little bit. I mean, you have to think there's some type of weird genius in that. But the operation, the execution, I mean, this is a guy who ran a casino business into the ground, which is not impossible to do. They're very expensive, capital-intensive projects. And the problem with Trump Taj Mahal was that they took out these high-interest loans that were like 14%, which was stupid to begin with, at a time when Atlantic City was kind of becoming past peak. So it was a beautiful casino when it opened. It became kind of like a trashy later on. Beautiful when it opened. That part of it was great, the kind of real estate part of it, but the finance, execution, details has not been his strong suit.
If you want to get a sense of how idiosyncratically fascinating Nate's book is, the retelling of Trump's failures in Atlantic City almost double as a love letter to the unique circumstance of Las Vegas. And it's just the sort of thing that you will get from this particular book. Yeah, the Trump thing, it's difficult because when he does something like that, and there's an ugliness to the questioning of Kamala's authenticity, the media reaction will be that this hurts him, and it could very well hurt him, divorced from the ethics of it all. But what's complicated about it in assessing, just strictly speaking, helps versus hurt, is that they'll say that for literally anything he does. And I lose track of when he is doing something that he often does, which is kind of saying an impolite thing that people are sensing, announcing the elephant in the room, when it's so reliably from the indigo blob, as you phrased it, regarded as a bad move. I lose track of when he's playing the game right for his own, his own strategy versus playing it wrong. I'm pretty sure he's playing it wrong when he's attacking the governor of Georgia. I'm pretty sure that one is playing it wrong. But this other stuff, I find it very hard to track and check against what the media is telling me.
It's very hard to have somebody who's perfectly calibrated, right? Where they only do the smart, eccentric things, but don't also do weird, eccentric things. It's like almost impossible. I think it probably literally is like two sides of the same coin. And on some level, there is something kind of quite like, my guess is that Trump probably has a fairly high IQ, at least along some dimensions, right? And that the instinct to tweak people has kind of served him well at various times. I mean, he's had some moments. I mean, he had that moment after the assassination attempt. He also had a low-key moment in the debate where kind of almost very good poker player's instinct, where he understood that Biden was going to really struggle to get through that 90 minutes, 100 minutes, whatever it was, right? And he didn't need to overdo it too much and like punches pulled and let Biden kind of punch himself out and be the story and don't make yourself sympathetic. Like that, I think was like quite smart tactically. And he also knew that like Biden wasn't capable of coherently pushing back. I mean, Trump told lots of shit that was total BS, right? Which is a problem anyway if there's not fact checking, but the better version of Biden would be able to pick up on one or two things and aggressively push back. And Biden was just totally unable to do it. And so he was showing ability to adapt in the moment and experiment. And you're probably never going to get somebody who like I said, always makes the right play in every situation. These high variance people are actually legitimately kind of weird and crazy a lot of the time, right? And again, being around these high net worth, successful individuals, I mean, a lot of them are kind of freaks, and it's the freakishness that makes them both successful and makes them complicated and infuriating to some people too.
That makes a lot of sense, just as it makes sense that Trump was at his most strategically savvy in pulling off what happened to be one of the greatest political missteps ever, which is agreeing to the debate and beating Biden so sufficiently, or letting Biden beat himself so sufficiently that he was taken out of the race and Trump was no longer assured of victory. I guess one more Trump question. I have learned to stop worrying and love the polls. I have decided to, similar to my thoughts on expediency and EA, I've decided I'm just going to believe the polls because it's easier. In 2022, believed the vibes over the polls. There was an expectation of red wave, and the New Yorker was writing about it, and that made sense to me. And it's funny, the cultural memory of that election is sort of different from what happened because people go, the polls were wrong. But when I look at the polls were actually right. It's that like the vibes were wrong. But then we've got this Trump situation where he has outperformed his polling, both in his victory in 2016 and in his narrow defeat in 2020. So what does a guy like you do about a guy like Trump? Do you go third time's a charm, or do you go, I expect him to overshoot the polling because of this or that?
It's a sample size of two. And so I guess I'll give the kind of stereotypical response, which is I don't think you should overgeneralize from that. But also the reason you shouldn't overgeneralize is because like pollsters are extremely aware of the errors that they make, and so therefore make adjustments to their methods. I mean, in 2022, you said the polls were actually pretty good. They were pretty good in 2018, for example. The previous presidential election before Trump, 2012, they were actually a little bit low on Democrats, but pretty good. But like, these are people that have incentives to get the right answer, even though polling is hard. So it's kind of like an efficient market hypothesis thing where like, can you outpick the consensus of like Wall Street equity desk analysts? I mean, maybe they're probably not the smartest people in the world relative to some other people, but they're probably at least pretty good, and they have like strong financial incentives to be right. And just because they like lowballed Amazon stock or whatever last time doesn't imply that they'll do so permanently. And so, yeah, it's not that the polls are always right. I mean, 2020 was a really bad year for the polls, and Biden was lucky that he held on to win the race, given how bad the polls were. And I was lucky, I guess, too, that Biden held on and the 10% didn't come through. But the vibes are not helping people to outpredict the polls. If anything, being a contrarian on the vibes might be better. You know what I mean? The delta somewhere between anti-vibes and polls is maybe not always a bad place to wind up.
Okay, well, this will be the last question, a fairly random one, but you write so much about a lot of other sports. I don't think you talk too often about football, and I'm developing a little theory that there's a lot of statistical low-hanging fruit in football, which is counterintuitive because it is the most watched sport in front of us. But Warren Sharp does a lot of deep dives in stats and was saying that the average play is negative for a passing play behind the line of scrimmage. You see all these screenplays and everything else that the coaches do, and it just seems like football is vibes. There's something weird going on where the people who do it know so much that there's such a high barrier of entry that we don't question them according to anything systemic beyond maybe when to punt or kick a field goal. Do you perceive football as having a lot of low-hanging fruit statistically? And one of the reasons that I'm asking is you mentioned efficient market hypothesis. I think that there is some thinking along those lines in football, which I could get into, but I won't. Or do you see it as, fairly appropriately analyzed? What's your view on football?
I think it's probably 70 or 80% of the way toward the optimal amount of stat nerdiness, right? Whereas hockey might be halfway, and baseball and basketball, I think, are more or less fully there. I think there's not a lot of low hanging fruit in those sports anymore. I'm kind of thinking about making it my spring or summer project next summer to build a new and improved NFL model. We have a pretty good model that I inherited from 538 where I own the IP. So it's kind of ELO ready with a quarterback adjustment, but might try to do some slightly cute things on top of that, looking at some of the more advanced play-by-play data and things like that. One thing I found is that models do really, really well for the Silver Bulletin newsletter. And the NFL in particular reminds me a little bit of it's an event, right? And event-driven stuff multiplied by models probably is very good for site traffic and signups. So at some point, there'll be very likely a new and improved NFL model at Silver Bulletin, probably not this year. But yeah, thinking about getting more into the NFL, which I haven't spent as much time on as baseball or basketball in my career.
Well, I can't wait for that, and I would recommend the Silver Bulletin to everybody. I want something non-vibes with football because the media analysis is vibes-based. Brock Purdy is always argued over. He has too much help. He's not as good as what he's doing, and who knows what the real answer is. But it occurs to me that nobody actually knows how to weigh having a good O-line versus having good exterior weapons. I mean, maybe Billy Walters does, but normal people don't. And so I just look at it as whatever a player is producing, similar to what the polls are, I'm going to believe they're that good because it is a fairly efficient market. Every team can only spend the same amount. And maybe you have great coaching, but you have worse talent, or you've got this, but not that. And so I'm digressing. Look, the main thing, dear listener, you should know is that this book that Nate has written is fascinating. I think you did a great job on it. I would recommend it, and I would recommend your Substack where you are quite generative and will be essential through this election season. So Nate, thank you so much for taking the time. This has been a fantastic, this has been a real pleasure to have this conversation.
Awesome, man. Thank you so much, Ethan.
Anytime.